So, bonsoir. My name is Miriam, and I'm the Deputy Director of Albertine Books, but I speak on behalf of everyone here at the Villa Albertine and the bookstore when I say that it is a great joy to welcome tonight Violaine Huisman, comme maman, to celebrate the publication of her wonderful novel, latest novel, Les Monuments de Paris, who was just released by Gallimard last month to very high acclaim in France. So, Violaine, I said it's an honor, but it doesn't define the whole, the feelings we have. We're all, I think, very moved to have you tonight, because we have been celebrating pretty much all the books you've been published so far, from the very big, your debut, The Fugitive Pasquerenne with the flamboyant Paul Holdengraber, La Rose Désert with our dear Omar Berrada. The translation of Fugitive Pasquerenne, The Book of Murder, was translated by Leslie Camille, who is with us tonight. Thank you, Leslie. And the book of Murder was a big hit with our book club, and I see two dear members of our book club. So this is all a kind of a weird family affair tonight. But more importantly, Marcel Proust, after whom Albertine is named, is a towering figure in Les Monuments de Paris, and we can see his influence in all your books. So what I'm trying to say, Violaine, is that your books are what bind us. They are part of what makes Albertine a community. So it is a real pleasure to have you with us. Violaine, you are a novelist, a translator, and the current cultural director of FIAF New York. And I see many of your colleagues here tonight. Thank you for the support and the friendship. And so your translation into French include True Crime by David Gran, The Hatred of Poetry by Ben Lerner, On Freedom by Maggie Nelson, and Nevada by Imogen Bini. Your debut novel, The Book of Murder, originally published by Gallimard, was published in the US by Scribner and was translated all around the world. It was awarded le Prix François Sagan and le Prix Marie-Claire, and it was longlisted for the International Booker Prize. And I think it's currently being adapted for the screen. Yes.
As a TV series.
Wow. Nice.
Well, it was optioned. I don't know that we can say that it's currently being adapted, but it was optioned for a TV series.
So maybe. Your second novel, Rose Désert, was published in 2019 by Gallimard to high acclaim as well. And your third novel, Les Monuments de Paris, will be published by Penguin Press in the US, so American readers, be patient, it is coming to you. Les Monuments de Paris follows a line opened with Fugitive Pasquerenne. It comes as a complement to your family narrative, but it also places it within a larger context, that of World War II and its aftermath, Les 30 Glorieuses, or the 30 glorious years. And it changed the configuration of your work, and it also presents you with new writing challenges. Your novel tells a public and intimate story of a Jewish family and its struggle to become assimilated within a society where anti-Semitism persists to our days. It also reads as an intimate narrative of the evolution of the power balance between men and women over the course of the 20th century. And before we dig any further, we would love you if you could read text that you wrote about les Monuments de Paris, and that was published in the Yale Review.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you all. It's very, I'm going to try not to get emotional as I thank you all for being here, because it's really special. It's very moving to see so many friends in this room and to feel so dearly celebrated in my hometown, in the city that I chose as my own. And I just came back from Paris, where I grew up, and where most of the action, if one can call it action, of the novel takes place. And I don't feel at home like this in Paris. I feel at home like this only at the French consulate in New York. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you so much, everyone at Albertine, for welcoming me so kindly and generously, and for being such true, devoted supporters of my work. What I'm going to read are the opening paragraphs of an essay that I wrote for the Yale Review as I was writing Les Monuments de Paris. So it took me 4 years to write this novel, and there were many different iterations of it. And through this iteration, I wrote it kind of as a synopsis in a way, as an essay in a 3,000-word format, which helped me also define the structure of the novel later on. And so these are the opening paragraphs of this story, of this essay, which gives a sense of the arc of the novel also, and gives a sort of a sense of the writing in English. This is something I wrote initially in English, so that's why it exists in English, because the novel otherwise is in French. It's called My Father's Library. On an autumn afternoon in Paris, I asked my father to tell me, once again, how he had started collecting books. A milky light glowed through the curtains of his top-floor apartment, a few blocks from where he was born, in the 16e. He was 9 years old, he said.
You're missing a part?
I'm missing a part. I'm sorry. Merci beaucoup. Non, toujours. But, okay, no, c'est bon, pardon. Sorry. He was 9 years old, he recalled, when he began to fill his childhood bookshelves with classic Larousse, purple postcard-sized paperbacks. Their contents were hardly what mattered. What he treasured was the harmony of their ensemble, the color field painting formed by their spines. A mauve sheen appeared in his rheumy eyes. Of course, they've been out of print for ages now. Gorgeous little books. At the age of 91, my father remembered only the distant past. The present had dissolved into an amorphous stream of hours broken by nurses' visits and pureed meals. I wedged a footstool between his recliner and wheelchair and leaned in so that he could hear me through my surgical mask. "Why don't you take that thing off your face?" he asked. You know, Papa, le Covid?" I faltered. "Ah, yes, of course," he pretended to remember. He brought my wrist to his lips to dispense tiny little kisses along my arm. "Ma chérie adorée, how sweet of you to visit your doddering old father." His fingernails were yellow and striated, like dandelions before they go to seed. As he dozed off mid-sentence, his hand still held mine. My father was 10 when the Second World War broke out in France. He told me many times about giving up his collection of classic Larousse when he, his parents, and his brothers abandoned their belongings and piled up in a car to flee the German troops marching on Paris. Over the next 6 years, his family lost everything: their home, their livelihood, many of their loved ones, and their French citizenship. As Jews, they went into exile in their own homeland, driven there by French anti-Semitic laws. They lived under an assumed name, at the mercy of benevolent strangers to escape roundups to concentration camps. For my father, the loss of his precious book collection was metonymic of that trauma. Later in life, he erected a citadel of books in compensation. To call my father a bon vivant wouldn't do him justice. He reveled in earthly pleasures with a zeal that bordered on pathology. He was married 4 times, the 3rd time to my mother, had more lovers than I would prefer to know, and fathered 8 children, of which I was the last. He liked nothing better than anything displayed in vast quantities. A cheese platter didn't deserve its name if it wasn't larger than the table it was served on. Dresses were to be purchased in racks. At restaurants, he was known for ordering the entire menu on behalf of his dinner guests so he could pick from everyone's plate. He adored l'Amérique, where I had moved at the age of 19, for its unabashed embrace of consumerism, its gargantuan salad bars, the dizzying heights and prismatic offerings of its supermarket aisles. On our transatlantic calls, my father mourned our separation, at once feverishly affectionate and exasperatingly narcissistic. The combination of the two made me miss him terribly and sigh with relief after we hung up. Putting a notion between us was my way of sidestepping Papa's monolithic shadow, of ignoring his treatment of women, of admiring and loving him from a safe distance. In July of 2020, I closed that distance. I moved my family of 4 across the Atlantic so I could be close to my father once more. His mental and physical state had steadily declined in the last several months. He had become too confused to talk on the phone. He was dying. And when he passed, I couldn't imagine not being by his side.
So Violaine, in your 2 previous novels, you revisited the life of Catherine Kremnitz, your dashingly beautiful mother, whose all-consuming love and volcanic moods had informed your childhood and your womanhood. And your father's family now is at the center of Les Monuments de Paris, a visionary author and an editor of philosophy with an exceptional knack for business. Denis Huisman was a relentless lover of women, as you just said, and he indulged in lavish displays of wealth. And when you published the book of Mother, you said that your motivation was to give your mother her humanity back, to balance the negative discourse you've heard about her in your father's family. And I was wondering if part of your motivation to write about your father now was to understand how he was, why was he so out of the ordinary and excessive in everything, and who was the little boy inside of him?
Yeah, I think the initial motivation for writing this novel was to write about my grandfather. And I realized, and I think the motivation in the same way, similar to the portrait I wanted to paint of my mother, was because my grandfather was somebody who had been ignored and who had been abused by history and abused by injustice, who had suffered a great injustice. And I felt that, and so in a way, my mother's character and my grandfather's character have in common that they suffered great injustices. But I realized my grandfather was this public servant just before the Second World War, who was then trapped by the Vichy government and lost everything during the war. But I realized that to get to this figure, to get to this character, I had to tell the story of my father. And it became a process. It became a narrative process to get to the heart of the story. Initially, the novel wasn't supposed to be about my father. But it couldn't be otherwise. Because again, to write is also, the motivation of my writing is very intimate, is very, it has to do with a deep emotional connection to the characters that I talk about. And I don't have an emotional connection at all to this grandfather because I never met him. He died 22 years before I was born. And I have an emotional connection to the sense of injustice, to his Jewishness, to my father's Jewishness. And so it was through that lens that I felt that I had something to contribute in telling his story.
That's perfect, thank you. So your grandfather was what we would call a model of integration. He was born to immigrants who spoke. You assume that they spoke Yiddish at home, and his father was an alphabet in French. His mother was a tutor, and he built his way to the top of the nation, and being a.
Yeah, he was a perfect example of the French meritocracy and the way education promoted social standing in the first half of the 20th century in particular. His father was a salesman from Belgium who spoke very little French, wrote very little, had no education, and my grandfather became a star student who completed the most elitist education one can get in France and became vice president to Paul Doumer in 1932. He, one of the highest ranking positions you can get in the French administration. And so my father grew up as a little kid in the Élysée Palace. And so when my father talked about the war, he would talk about the war in this completely incomprehensible way, because he wouldn't just talk about the war. He would talk about what happened before the war, what happened during the war, what happened after the war, and all of it at once. And so he would talk about growing up in the Élysée Palace, and in 1941 in Marseille, not having a coat in the winter, and the Mistral, the wind in Marseille blowing very hard, and it being desperately cold and not having a coat. And this was the story. This, to me, was the story. And so, in a way, the novel became the project of the novel became to find a way to try to unpack this story and to unfurl it in a narrative way, in a way that could communicate also this confusion and the sense of drama that my father experienced in the way that he talked about his father. His father was this public servant. His father was this man who came from nothing and rose up the ranks of the French government to become this very important public figure, and then lost everything again. And in a way, what was interesting to me about this character of my grandfather was that my father could never understand this déclassement, to be demoted like this, because my father had not grown up in poverty, or had not grown up at the, even as a lower middle class person like his father had. So my father didn't know anything other than just prestige and social standing. But I suspect that his father did know what it was like to be poor. And when he lost everything, he returned to poverty in a way that, didn't make sense to the subsequent generations. And to me, again, to go back to the motivation of the writing is the sense of being able, through literature, to tell the complexity of a life, to tell the complexity of a historical moment that involves a lot of very personal details and a lot of very intimate moments that are deeply integrated in the fabric of this life. And there aren't many other art forms that allow to do that. It's I think, to me, at least as a reader, the magic of literature to be able to layer on all these different aspects of life.
We're going to my second point. No, I think it is very interesting what you just said, and your two previous books were written based on narrative. I mean, you come from a family where narratives are everything. Your parents didn't read to you at night. They would tell you stories. They would invent stories. I mean, it feels, when we read your family story, we feel that, I mean, stories are coming everywhere. And so I was wondering, how different was it to write, the experience of writing Les Monuments de Paris? Could you tell us about the difference of writing that novel compared to your two previous ones?
Yeah, and it's true. My parents were amazing storytellers, and they had also a slightly logorrheic tendency. So they were great storytellers, but who would just never stop. So they would just keep telling and telling and telling in a very digressive form. So the story didn't really have a beginning or an end, and sometimes you had to remind them, like if you cared about what actually happened next, you had to remind them that you were still waiting for the punchline. But so I wanted to present these stories in the fabric of the novel also, and their voices were very important to me in the narrative. That process, and the book of Mother, Fugitive parce que reine, includes long monologue in my mother's voice, and that voice I can sort of switch it on anytime. Like right now, I could probably just like freestyle one of my mother's monologues. For my father's voice, I hear it just as clearly in my head, but it's a voice that's unbelievably erudite. And so it's a voice that involves very sophisticated language and also deeply very fine details about French history, about French literature. There's probably a quote or two in there. And so I could summon the voice and I could summon the rhythm of the voice, but then I had to go back and do some research to fill in to fill in the blanks. So I could sort of write it as with placeholders. Like I know the voice goes like this, musically, but then like within I need to insert a quote, a detail about like some anecdote about the First World War, some anecdote about the Second World War. And so that is to say that this novel was very different for me because it involved a lot of research. The story of my grandfather embedded in the story is the life story of Georges Huisman, my grandfather, who was born the year the Eiffel Tower was erected in 1889 and died in 1957. It's a period in France that covers 2 world wars, and that I wasn't familiar with, not familiar with enough to be able to write about it competently or to at least understand what it means. We were talking earlier with Miriam about an interview I just did in Paris, found footage of my grandfather on the French radio in 1950 something. The interviewer on the radio asked him to talk about the two most salient events in his life the two most salient events in French history in the last half century. This is like 1950 in France. Not counting the 2 world wars, the interviewer says, because, if I let you talk about the 2 world wars, like then everybody would only talk about the wars. And Georges Huisman replies, "This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard." What am I supposed to talk about? What do you mean, don't talk about the wars? What else is there to talk about? I mean, I've experienced 2 world wars. Yes, we're going to talk about the wars. And so, to me, it was very interesting to hear him say this, because it's also the research that I had to conduct was about trying to understand what those wars meant. Of course, historically, what happened during those wars, but also what they could possibly mean, and try to have an interpretation of what it might have felt like for somebody living through them. So that was a totally different process for me than just writing from memory or writing from affect.
And because George graduated from l'École des Chartes, which is the most prestigious school if you want to become a museum curator, but it's what you learn is how to become an archivist. And so we have the feeling when you write, because the novel is written as a journey, journey where you're trying to write the story of your father's family, and we follow you in all the detours and embûches and accident. And there is this we feel like the shadow of George a little bit over your shoulder when you're in the grenier at Valmondois. And
I wanted to conduct all of this research to have this information at hand and to understand the character, but I didn't want to write a historical novel. And so instead, I staged the process of writing this novel. So I staged a character that's another version of me as a narrator returning to Paris to be by her father's bedside and going on this journey of trying to understand her father, and through her father, her grandfather, and conducting the research. So the research that I conducted in real life is also staged in the novel. And through that, there's a sense of, there's a layering of storylines, necessarily, because there are different chronologies throughout the novel. But then it's true that Georges has a whole section of the book devoted to him that stages his life and gives the arc of his life, but his presence sort of hovers over the entire story as the narrator understands it. So at the beginning of the novel, she doesn't really know who he is, but he's there somewhere in the streets of Paris, in the monuments of Paris. And there's a scene in the novel which I really remembered as at some point in the writing, and like many other scenes in the novel, it was a moment I remembered and I tried to write down, and I wasn't sure whether it would stay in the final manuscript, but then it presented itself as a kind of defining moment that became a sort of metaphor for the rest of the novel. There's a Place du Trocadéro is a very famous square in Paris, right across from the Arc de Triomphe, so the Champs-Élysées on the other side. And the Place du Trocadéro faces the Eiffel Tower. And there's a palais right there, which is the Palais de Chaillot, which Georges Huisman, my grandfather, was responsible for renovating. So that whole esplanade, the way it looks today, that square was created under my grandfather. So he's responsible for the way it looks today. And what I remembered, and I didn't know that when I started writing the novel, and I didn't know that when I remembered being in the car with my father around the Place du Trocadéro, and my father telling me the stories of all the names of the streets, because all the names of the streets around the Place du Trocadéro are figures of the Third Republic, are figures of people that my grandfather worked with. Avenue Paul Doumer was the president under which Georges served. There's Avenue Georges Mandel. There's all these great figures of the Third Republic. But then the point of the Place du Trocadéro was not these great men, was not the Palais, was not the Eiffel Tower. It was Carrette. It was that that boulangerie that serves these little tiny sandwiches that are only in this boulangerie in Paris. And this was the point of that square. That's why we stopped there. That's why we went to the Place du Trocadéro. And so it's that sort of archaeology of memory, the way that streets of Paris sort of function as mnemonic devices, as reminders of other moments in history, and also have these memory layered on top of each other. And it could go back way further in time. I mean, Paris is an old city, so you could keep going. Like under the Palais de Chaillot was this other palais that was built by Napoleon, and under that was something else, you know. So that's and in a way, writing functions the same way. Under each sentence and under each word, there's a layer of meaning. There's a layer of references. There's always more to dig. There's a layer of associations also, which I can't guess, but every reader in reading a sentence will have their own associations, their own affect, and that, I think, is also the great thrill of literature, that it allows this world to open up for each person who engages with reading.
Yeah, so no, it's beautiful what you just said, and it's a feeling we have when we read your novels, that you write. I mean, we can start with Les Monuments de Paris. You borrow the title from a book that was written by your grandfather and was considered as his best work, pour comprendre les monuments de Paris. So yeah. I'm going to ask the question because I wrote it down, but you've already answered. Your vision of or your conception of writing is writing. Can we write something else in a palimpsest? That's when we write today.
Yeah, in a way, I think it's impossible not to write versions of a story that have already been told. I mean, all stories have already been told, and it's also in writing one's family stories, necessarily there's going to be a rewriting of stories that have already been told within the family, but then it's the way you frame it, it's the way you choose to narrate it that makes the difference. But I think in another way, the motivation was also to try to write a story. You know, it so happens that the people in my family were these kinds of grandiose figures, or at least my grandfather was this very impressive figure who did pretty amazing things before the Second World War. He was responsible for the creation of the Cannes Film Festival. He was responsible for the safeguard of many of the masterpieces of French museums. He saved the stained glass in the Sainte-Chapelle by creating this incredibly elaborate plan for 4 years leading up to the war to prepare a dismantling plan of the stained glass of the Sainte-Chapelle in case of bombings on Paris. That's how much he cared about art, and medieval art in particular. So I was lucky to have this incredible material, but I feel that each of us have this great figure in our family history that we felt has been underrepresented, has been unjustly treated, or maybe has been forgotten, and that we'd love to revive, and that we'd love to leave a trace of. And I feel that in a way, the way I framed the novel can also be a kind of roadmap, or can be an inspiration for, if it works, for how one goes on this journey, how one tells this story. And that's not to say that, I'm imagining that people will go and, follow this path and write their own novel, but it's that in the process of reading, you can sort of, as a reader, stage yourself on this journey. You can sort of imagine what it would feel like to build this narrative.
Thank you. And there's something else that your recreation of the past, your vision of the past is really breathtaking. But what is also, I think, very, very interesting is all those how you question the past from the present and see there's some invisible link, but constant in the narration. And there's one scene, for instance, that I'd like to discuss, and it's. I said because it is what is beautiful in your novel is that you deal with very, very painful history. It's both, I mean, collective pain, of course, but also very intimate trauma. And it's the scene at the funeral of your father, and your half-brother Bruno has put on display the false ID card that your father and grandmother were using during the war, and that's when your very close friend, your best friends from childhood, who loves you unconditionally, I have no doubt, just realized that your father was actually Jewish.
Yeah, it was that moment in real life when my two closest childhood friends came to my father's funeral in this little village just outside of Paris, where we have where our dead are buried, and we have a family home. And in the family home, which now belongs to my brother had displayed on the mantle of the fireplace these old photographs of the war and the fake IDs of our family. And my two closest friends look at these pictures and they're like, "Who's that?" I'm like, "Well, that's obviously that's my father, and that's my grandfather, and that's my grandmother." And they're like, "Fake IDs?" And I'm like, "Girls, there was a war. Jews were persecuted during the war. I mean, you know about it, right?" And they're like, "Yeah, but your father?" And in a way, it struck me as a really troubling paradox for them that my father could be this quintessentially French man, this quintessentially elegant man, this very wealthy person, this womanizer, this person like on the highest social standing in France, who had once been persecuted, who had once had to live under an assumed name, who had once lived in poverty. Like, they couldn't reconcile it. And in a way, I can't reconcile it. I mean, I feel similarly, except that my father told me this story every day of his life. So I have a different sensitivity to it. But there was a point in the writing also where I felt like what in French we call a devoir de mémoire. What is it in English?
An obligation,
like
a moral obligation to memory, to
an
remember.
Obligation, a moral obligation to telling this story, a moral obligation to preserving what I also own personally of this story. Meaning, the war was already distant from me growing up, but because my father was a contemporary of the war, because my father had experienced it in his flesh, I felt that the way that he had communicated it to me, the way he had shared it with me in this very intimate way, also made me bear witness to something that will be lost in the next generations. The way, when I tell my daughters about the war, it'll be different because I'll be telling my father's story, but I won't be able to tell it with the same affect, with the same intensity that drove my father's accounts.
But there's, and maybe I read it, I overread it or I'm over-interpreting it, but what I read in this passage also was like an opposition, very poisonous, of what a Frenchman looks and what a Jewish man should look, and that we cannot, and they're definitely not anti-Semitic. You cannot blame them for, but it's like a poison that has gone through our bones, and we really can't cure our mind out of it. And it's
I think it's the tradition of assimilation in France is so poisonous that to this day you can't reconcile any other identity than French with Frenchness. You can't be a quintessential Frenchman and be Jew and be Jewish and be anything else. There's no end. You're just fully assimilated French. And and I think that's still very operative in French society today, and that's still and
that both assimilation goes hand in hand, the assimilation of
one
of
thing
the minority and of the feeling of rejecting this minority.
Yeah, and one thing that I realized just recently, as I was thinking about this and thinking about the fact that my father's family was a very assimilated family before the war. They weren't practicing Jews. They were Jewish. They would not deny that they were Jewish, but they weren't. They were secular Jews. They were secular Jews who celebrated French holidays, and Christian holidays like every French person, and I started wondering whether the war hadn't also stripped them of their Jewish identity in a very paradoxical way, meaning that my father always told me that he wasn't Jewish. My father would tell me he wasn't Jewish, and meanwhile also tell me that he was persecuted during the war, and I was like, how does that work? He's like, no, of course I'm Jewish. Of course we're Jewish, but it depends on who tells you you're Jewish. And so in a way, it felt like maybe after the war, they could not really call themselves Jewish anymore. They had been stripped of that too, of even their assimilated Jewishness had been taken away from them.
Thank you. Now let's move on to a more uplifting topics. It's the woman. You have some fantastic woman character in your novels, and I was wondering, there's Marcel, of course. I have a question about Marcel, because Marcel is Georges' wife, and Georges is having an affair, a love affair, a real deep affair. He has, you identify just a main affair with Chute, who is a duchess. Oui, she's a duchess. She's a very sexy woman, independent financially. She's a widower, and she does what she wants, basically, in life. And so they have this wonderful love affair, and Marcel is here, and she's the mother of 3 kids, and she stands by her man. They are in Marseille. They flew Paris. There's the Marsilia. I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about Marsilia, but it's also a big chunk of the novel. Anyway, she's here, and your grandfather abandoned her, and he ran away with Chute. And then one night he comes back, and he asked Denis, your father, to come with him and Chute, and to just abandon Marcel. And Denis defends his mother, say, no, you can go if you want, I'm staying with her. And Georges stays, come back, actually, the next day. But Marcel, she just take him back here. You don't invent. There's no scene. She just opened the door, and well, she's a Madonna. She's a mother. She's a wife. She's the perfect wife. So I was wondering what was your how did you build this character? What was the substract to it? It was archive. It was memory. It was family narrative. Was it what did you base her on?
When as you were telling this story, I was just reminded that a friend of mine recently read the novel and texted me these very kind, generous comments, and then he said, "I'm really curious to hear about the measure of betrayal / fidelity in the novel." And as I read it, I thought he meant betrayal / fidelity in the parents' characters. And he was talking about fact and fiction. And I was like, oh. But I think, in a way, it's an interesting metaphor, because there's a lot of betrayal of reality, of betrayal of the facts, and there's also, there's a lot of fiction built into the narrative, but it's faithful to a certain kind of affect, it's faithful to a certain kind of emotion, and the character of I knew my grandmother, Georges' wife, and then widow. I knew for a long time. She died when I was 17, but I didn't really have a strong sense of her, and I didn't really build her character based on my memories. I built her character based on the life of Georges' character, and then the character of the lover, of his love interest, Shoot, to me was really kind of an idealistic 1930s woman who could be just a great, a great Hollywood figure. Like I really wanted that part of the novel to be just this amazing love story, and
she is.
And so and then, I mean, beyond, there was also, to me, in this character, the possibility of reviving my mother, or inserting some figure, some version of my mother's ghost into that story. So so this character of Shoot, a duchess, is kind of a cross between my mother, or my mother's character in the Book of Mother, in Fugitive parce que reine, and Oriane de Guermantes. She's like, she has like one foot in my work and one foot in La Recherche. And in a way, to me, that is, if I had to build like an even larger motivation, like an ideal motivation, it would be for these characters, for my writing to be able to exist, in the Albertine library, in a library where all these different characters can coexist and can, live across stories, live across centuries, live across time, and speak to each other. I can imagine, I can sort of fantasize a world in which these characters can just, like, on the wall, all these books on the wall, sort of like at night, create new stories. They just go off, and I don't know what happens between them, but something might happen.
It's a woman pendant of Alberto Manguel library. Mm-hmm. I love that idea. So there's two other women that are very important in the novel, and that arrive at the end. It's your two friends, whom we met at the funeral scene, and that we'll spend more time with them towards the end. And I just wanted to note there's a very subtle movements. So the narrative move from the beginning, where your father takes all the place in his daughter's narrative, and then it focuses more and more, and then we have this woman who appears and who are like the saxifrage, to quote your mother's book, those little plants that grows between stones, and then you enter your friends who are the main characters, who are real trees. They're strong, they're powerful. They win one of them win a prize at a big prize at the Festival de Cannes, and I wanted to give you the opportunity of saying a few words about them and their importance in your. How important were they when you built the story?
They are also recurring characters across the three novels, so they come back and they're part of the story. They're a really integral part of the story. And in this novel, of course, in the staging of the narration, there was also the staging of a girl writing this story. And I mean a girl, I mean a girl, not a woman, meaning, as the last child in a family of 8, as the last child being a girl, there's a sense of like it not being your place to tell that story, and it takes a century. It takes a century across French history for women to start having a voice, for women to start having a real place in society, for women to be able to choose their careers, for women to be able to win prizes at the Cannes Film Festival. And so that's also the arc of the narrative, that this is a woman, the narrator of the novel is a woman living today in the 21st century after a century of voicelessness. And so, her friends, her counterparts in the story are very independent women who themselves don't have kids. And weaved into the narrative is also that complexity of being a woman artist and what it means to be a woman artist when you also want to be a mother, when you also want to have a family. All of these questions that have been relevant questions across history, but are relevant questions in a different way today, that women have a different place in society. And to me, I couldn't write this book without it being part of the story. I couldn't imagine writing a book about 2 towering male figures without having a female point of view, or having that counterpart, at least addressing the question of what it means to deal with these towering male figures. And by that I don't mean to say that, it's not about erasing them. Clearly, it's about acknowledging the journey.
Thank you. And my very last question will be about. I apologize because we were a bit all over the place, but the novel reads really extremely easily. And there's a lot of narrative, but Violaine does an amazing job at linking them all together, and you never feel lost. You always follow a thread, and the architecture of the novel is somehow is brilliant, really, and it has. I wanted. I mean, she will describe it much better than I do. I would like you to say a few words about the general architecture, but also about. There's a beautiful circular movement in the novel. Your father, when you describe the life of your father and grandfather, you go full circle. They are born, a few houses of where they will die. Their whole life is like coming for, and it reminded me a bit of the Proustian circles, in Time Again, when the narrator realized that there's a little shortcuts that connect le côté de Guermantes and le côté de chez Swann, and that all the whole narrative is a big round. So I wanted to just say a few words about that, and then we'll turn the floor to the question.
Yeah, it's a journey. I mean, I think the novel is really structured as a journey, it could be a promenade, like a walk across Paris, and a set of associations, the set of associations that you might have as you take a walk, and you reach your destination in the end. I think the novel in the end reaches its destination. You end the journey, but in a way, it's not prescribed. I think, again, to me, like the distance from the historical novel or from the preordained narrative is that, to me, in a way, there's a lot of that kind of fiction in which you know how it's gonna fall. There's a sort of preordained structure before you even start reading, or as you start reading, you know how it's gonna go. And I didn't know how it was going to go, and I wanted to show that, and I wanted that to be true in the reading experience also, that you don't really know where it's going to go, but that you can have faith in the person have enough faith in the person telling you the story that you know you're getting somewhere.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'd like for you to maybe explore a little more with us the theme of assimilation, because my understanding of French Jews of North African background is they're not assimilated. They're very French, they're Francophone, and they're very Jewish. What you talked about seems to reflect now an increasingly small part of French Jewish society.
Yeah, I'm truly not a specialist on French Judaism, and it's a very complex question, and you're right that there's a strong difference in French society between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews, and they have very different histories and different histories of assimilation. My family was Ashkenazi, and that's the family, that's that wave of assimilation has its own history. I think Léon Blum is the person who writes about it most eloquently, and what he writes in the short opus that he wrote about the Dreyfus affair, but also about Jewish assimilation, is that in his era, what happened with Jewish assimilation happened through education. And it was through education that Jews became assimilated. And in fact, it was very notable during the Third Republic, when my grandfather was part of the French government. There were many, many, many Jews as part of the French government. And that changed radically after the war. And that changed before, and that was not the case before, and that was not the case after. It was really a moment in history when this whole class of Jews became assimilated through education. But there's, I think that history is also interesting in the context of Zionism. There was also a different kinds of Jews in France were invested in the question of Israel or not, and I think it continues to be operative today. And that's something that really moved me when I researched my grandfather's story. Again, my father would say that we were not Jewish. My father didn't care about Israel particularly. He never even imagined going to Israel. And I discovered that his father had been very invested in the creation of Israel. And meanwhile, at that time, towards the end of his life, he had become conseiller d'État. It was a position in the French government where you wrote laws, you contributed to the writing of laws, and he had a law passed to allow French Jews who wanted to change their names to be able to change their names. So at the same moment, he was helping French Jews erase their Jewish identity from their names and also support the creation of the State of Israel. And to me, maybe it's not a paradox. Maybe there's no paradox there, but I do see a strong dichotomy, nevertheless.
So your mom is or was Jewish? Your dad was, but if your mom is Jewish, then you're Jewish, but if your mom is not, then you're not.
Yeah, my mom, yeah, it's hard to know with my mom. I mean, but I think she was Jewish. I think she was Jewish too. At least her father was Jewish. She was raised Catholic, but her father was Jewish. And her grandmother apparently.
Was Jewish.
So A lot of Jewish blood, at
So
least.
this was for you a search of your roots. You were looking for your Jewish, maybe your Jewish roots?
Maybe that wasn't necessarily the point for me, but yes, that can also be part of the story.
I just have a simple question. If your father had false identity papers, how did he escape deportation? Because there were many Jews who had false identity papers and were deported.
Yeah, they were. So there were many different waves of deportation in France, and at some point in Paris, there was, and they were living in the south of France for 3 years during the war. Well, when there was a free zone. When there was a free zone, they lived in the free zone. So they lived in Marseille, south of Vichy. South of Vichy was the free zone, and north of Vichy was the zone occupée, the occupied territories. And then the whole country was occupied, and they moved back to Paris. And in fact, of course, there were lots of waves of deportations in Paris, and there were many French Jews that went to concentration camps, but a lot fewer Jews were deported from France than from neighboring countries. And that's a very sensitive point, because the French right and the French far right has used that argument to claim that the Vichy regime protected French Jews. That's absolutely untrue. The Vichy regime assassinated French Jews. What they did do, though, is that they assassinated foreign Jews first. So they focused on deporting foreign Jews before they focused on French Jews. But then when their numbers were lagging, they focused on French Jews. But France had very strong networks of resistance, and the French populations, despite being, fairly commonly anti-Semitic, didn't like the idea of people being sent to camps. It became known, and there were lots of support networks. My father's grandfather, who was, who didn't speak very good French, who barely wrote, who was not educated and had lost his wife during the war, was living on his own in his little apartment in the 16th and was very confused. And my father told this very, very moving story of coming back from south of France, moving back to Paris during the war, and finding his grandfather totally confused, carrying in his pocket both his fake ID and his real ID. And he wasn't deported. How did that happen? There were, if you're interested in that question, I strongly recommend the writing of the young French historian named Laurent Joly, who wrote very recently several incredibly powerful books about specifically the arrests and deportations of French Jews in Paris.
With much enthusiasm, I've always found so much poetry in your work, actually, and I enjoy growing between the two languages and reading your work in French. So I was wondering if you could talk about your translation process, since we as an audience have grilled you on other subjects, but your translation process is very special, and I was wondering if you could share a bit of that with us today.
my translation process is very special, and I'm a translator into French also, and I do write in English. The essay that I read from earlier, I wrote in English, and it's very difficult to translation is a whole other process than writing, and most of the time, you don't know what your voice sounds like in another language, except when you do have a voice in another language. I'm very lucky to have Leslie Cammy here in the room, and my beautiful editor, Valerie Steiker. And both Valerie and Leslie were very involved in the process of translating the Book of Mother. We worked very collaboratively. It was a kind of insane process, but we all made it work somehow. And there were lots of back and forths, and there was just, I think, really a lot of generosity at play, where we all contributed and we all felt very generous towards one another. And I also want to acknowledge another translator, who's my daughter Georges, who when I was revising the translation of, when I was revising Leslie's translation of the Book of Mother, Leslie and I had agreed from the very beginning that there's the poem at the end of the book, which is a poem that I wrote in real life to my mother as a 10-year-old. She wouldn't translate. She wouldn't touch it. She was like, you deal with this poem. I don't know what to do about it. And it was during COVID, and so we were homeschooling, and I asked my daughter Georges, who was not quite 10, but almost, if she wanted to try to write it in English. And she did. So the poem that I wrote to my mother and then published in Fugitive par Corinne is now a poem by my daughter to me in the Book of Mother, which is a very beautiful process.
And
I'm sorry, Cici is also in the room. My second daughter, she didn't translate the poem, but she did many other things. And she is also a character in Les Monuments de Paris, and she has definitely as many words as Georges does. I checked.
thank you. So thank you, Violaine. Thank you for this wonderful and generous conversation. And everyone, Violaine is very kindly, very generously treating us to a very nice buffet. So I suggest you hang around, you stay with us. Her books are for sale. Have a drink, have your book signed, and thank you again for coming.